They pounded on my door like I was a criminal, their voices sharp, their presence overwhelming. Two men in uniforms, badges flashing in the sunlight, stood ready to drag me away from my own home. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, whispering, judging. I felt the weight of every stereotype, every silent accusation pressing down on me. But something about their story didn't add up. Their warrant, their authority. None of it felt real. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just an arrest, it was something far worse. What they didn't know? They picked the wrong man to intimidate. Life in the new neighborhood felt like a dream at first. After years of working long shifts and countless sacrifices, he finally gave his family the home they deserved. A quiet street lined with manicured lawns, a community pool where children laughed during summer, and houses that gleamed under the morning sun. For a black man who had climbed the ranks to become chief of police, this was more than a house. It was a symbol of every obstacle he had overcome. Every morning he rose before dawn, savoring the calm before the day's demands. His wife brewed coffee as the soft hum of cartoons drifted from the living room where their little girl giggled in her pajamas. These were the moments that mattered, the simple rhythm of family life, free from the chaos of the job. And in this neighborhood, he wanted nothing more than to be just another dad mowing his lawn on weekends, waving to neighbors as they passed by. But not everyone waved back. It started with glances, the kind that lingered too long, as if trying to decide whether you belong. Then came the whispers, quiet enough to ignore until they weren't. A note tucked into the mailbox about the trash bins being out too early. A neighbor walking her dog reminding him of the community standards with a tone that stung like a slap. He brushed it off at first. Every neighborhood had rules, right? But there was something different here, something colder behind the smiles that never reached their eyes. The first letter from the HOA arrived a few weeks later, polite, almost friendly, just a notice about a minor violation. The grass had grown half an inch too high, they said. He paid the fine without question. But then came another letter, and another, each one harsher than the last, each one laced with the suggestion that he wasn't following the rules. Except he was. He knew the regulations better than most. After, all his life depended on order and discipline. Late one evening, as he walked back from taking out the trash, he caught two neighbors talking in hushed voices near the curb. They stopped abruptly when they saw him, offering tight smiles before retreating into their homes. It was the kind of silence that said more than words ever could. And for the first time, he wondered if this dream home had a cost he wasn't prepared to pay. What he didn't know then was that the rules were never the real issue. And soon, the people hiding behind those rules would show just how far they were willing to go to push him out. The second letter came less than a week after. The first, this time the tone was sharper. They accused him of parking violations, claims so absurd he almost laughed. His car was parked neatly in the driveway, exactly as the handbook instructed. Still, the letter ended with a threat. Repeated violations could lead to fines, and continued noncompliance could result in further action. He crumpled the paper in his hands that night, but deep down a chill settled in. He had seen this pattern before, power disguised as policy, rules twisted into weapons. Not in a neighborhood like this, but in the very system he served. The thought that it was happening to him in his own home gnawed at his pride. He had spent years enforcing laws fairly, ensuring justice for those who felt powerless. Yet here he was, a black man in a nice neighborhood, treated like a criminal for what? Living. The harassment didn't stop at letters. It spread like rot through the quiet corners of daily life. Small things at first, a neighbor refusing to return his greeting, another moving their child away when his daughter joined the playground. Then came the comments, dressed as casual remarks but heavy with venom. "You must be doing well for yourself," one man said, eyes glancing toward his car as if it were stolen. Another praised his lawn with a smirk that didn't match his words. "Looks great now. Took you a while to figure it out, huh?" He swallowed the anger, each time telling himself it wasn't worth the fight. He had too much to lose. His career, his peace, his family's happiness. So he smiled, nodded, and walked away. But every slight carved a wound deeper than the last. He began to notice the pattern. Every HOA meeting was scheduled without notice. Every vote taken when he wasn't there. Fines appeared for imaginary infractions, holiday lights installed a day early, a trash can visible for 15 minutes. Too long. And yet other neighbors broke the same rules without consequence. The injustice was glaring, but the silence was louder. One evening, his wife showed him an email that left her trembling. It came from an anonymous account, filled with words too ugly to repeat. It didn't mention his name, but it didn't have to. People like you, it said, never belonged here and never will. The message ended with a chilling warning. Leave before we make you. He stared at the screen, fury and fear warring inside him. Reporting it would mean exposure. Ignoring it would mean surrender. He chose neither. He documented everything, every letter, every fine, every whisper of hate. Then came the HOA board, meeting that confirmed his worst fears. They didn't know he was listening from outside the half-open door. Voices spilled into the hallway, sharp and bitter. He's a problem, one said. If we let this slide, more will come. Another voice, dripping with disdain, replied, we just need to make him uncomfortable enough, he'll get the message. And then, the words that froze his blood. If he won't leave, we'll find a way to force him out. That night, he sat in his living room long after his family had gone to bed, staring into the dark. They weren't just harassing him, they were plotting to remove him. But how far would they go? That question lingered like a storm cloud over the next few days, and the answer came sooner than he imagined. It started with a letter, slipped under the door instead of mailed. No fines this time, no warnings. Just a date and time, bold and final. Tuesday, 3 p.m. Compliance check. Failure to cooperate will result in enforcement action. His pulse spiked as he read it. Enforcement action? What did that even mean? He knew HOA boards had power, but this sounded different. It sounded dangerous. Tuesday came like a drumbeat. At 2:59 p.m. he stood by the window scanning the street. His wife asked if he was okay and he forced a smile. But his gut told him something was coming. Something big. Then, 3 sharp knocks on the door. Not the kind neighbors use, the kind that means authority, urgency, control. He opened it slowly, and there they were. 2 men in uniforms, their badges gleaming in the afternoon sun. They stood tall, hands resting near their belts, voices clipped as they announced they had a warrant for his arrest. The world tilted. Arrest? For what? Behind them, a few neighbors had gathered, their faces masks of feigned curiosity. He felt their eyes burning into him, waiting to see him hauled away like a criminal. Rage and humiliation flooded his veins. He asked for the warrant, and they handed over a piece of paper stamped with official-looking seals. But something was wrong. The language was vague, the signatures unfamiliar. He scanned their badges, names that didn't ring any bells. And then, the detail that set every alarm bell ringing. The county name was misspelled. These weren't real. Officers. His heart pounded, but he kept his face calm. They barked orders telling him to turn around, to comply, or face consequences. Their voices were firm, rehearsed, but not perfect. Tiny cracks in their performance betrayed them. And as those cracks widened, so did his resolve. What they didn't know was that the man they were trying to arrest wasn't just any homeowner. He was the chief of police. And they had just crossed a line that would shatter their entire scheme. The men stood rigid on the porch, their presence casting a shadow over the bright afternoon. Their uniforms were convincing at a glance. Navy shirts, gold badges, polished boots. But to his trained eyes, the flaws stood out like cracks in glass. The stitching on the patches wasn't standard issue. The badges, though shiny, lacked the weight of authenticity. And their stance, too casual for real law enforcement, too eager for confrontation. Still, to anyone watching from behind their curtains, it looked real enough. And that was the point. They repeated their demand, voices louder this time, as if volume could cover the truth. He kept his tone calm, asking for clarification, for credentials, for something official. One of them smirked, flashing the piece of paper like a trophy. "Court issued," he said with a confidence that didn't reach his eyes. The document bore seals and signatures, but the formatting was sloppy. And then, the fatal mistake. A misspelled county name. An error no legitimate court order would ever allow. Inside, his wife clutched their daughter close, fear etched across her face. Through the window, he could feel the weight of the neighborhood pressing in. People had gathered, some standing openly, others peering through blinds, waiting, watching, silent spectators to what they believed was justice, or perhaps what they hoped would be humiliation. He felt the heat rising in his chest, anger clawing at the edges of his composure, not because of the threat, but because of what it represented. This wasn't just about him, it was about every time power had been. He stepped back slowly, as if considering compliance, and asked them to wait a moment. His voice was steady, betraying none of the storm inside. He closed the door gently, not slamming it, not giving them the satisfaction of a scene. Then he walked to his study, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. No explanation. Just an address. A tone that said everything without words. When he returned to the door, the men straightened, expecting submission. Instead, they found a man who stood taller than before, authority radiating from every line of his face. He looked them in the eye, steady, unblinking, and told them calmly that their game was over. They sneered, one taking a step forward, hand hovering near his belt in a pathetic imitation of police posture. And then, in one smooth motion, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a badge. Not just any badge. The badge. The sunlight caught the metal, gleaming brighter than the counterfeit shields pinned to their chests. Chief of Police. The title they could never fake. For a split second, their confidence shattered, replaced by a flicker of panic. Their mouths opened, closed, searching for words that wouldn't come. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Power doesn't shout, it resonates. He informed them, in measured tones, that they were under arrest for impersonating law, enforcement trespassing, and attempted kidnapping. The smirk vanished, the bravado crumbled, and in its place bloomed the raw, unfiltered fear of men who realized the hunt had turned on them. Behind them, murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd. Neighbors leaned forward, straining to hear, eyes wide with disbelief. The story they had expected, a black man dragged away in shame, was unraveling before them. Instead, they were witnessing justice unfold in a way they never saw coming. Then came the sound. Sirens. Low at first, then swelling, cutting through the thick tension like a blade. Real law enforcement vehicles rounded the corner, lights flashing, engines roaring. His people, his team. The very force these imposters thought they could mimic now bore down on them with the weight of the law. The men stiffened, their false authority dissolving into visible dread. They tried to speak, to explain, to spin a tale that might save them. But it was too late. The cuffs clicked around their wrists, cold and final. The neighbors watched in stunned silence as the fake officers, the enforcers of the HOA's hate, were led away, heads bowed, their sham uniforms now symbols of disgrace. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Because if these men were bold enough to show up at his door, dressed in lies and armed with intimidation, they weren't acting alone. Someone sent them. Someone thought this plan would succeed, and that someone was about to learn what real accountability looks like. As the patrol cars pulled away, carrying the imposters toward a future they never imagined, he stood on his porch, scanning the faces of those who had gathered to witness his humiliation. Some turned away, others stared back, wide-eyed, mouths slightly open. And then his gaze landed on one man, the HOA president, standing stiff and pale, the confidence drained from his smug expression. Her eyes locked. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. This isn't finished. What happened next would expose the entire rotten core of the HOA's conspiracy, and it would shake this neighborhood to its foundations. The days following the arrests felt like stepping into a storm after the calm. What had happened on his porch wasn't just an incident. It was a fracture that split open everything festering beneath the surface of this picture-perfect neighborhood. And now, the truth was seeping out for everyone to see. The investigation moved swiftly. When you're the chief of police, there's no room for half measures, especially when a hate-driven conspiracy tries to masquerade as law. The two men who stood on his porch in stolen authority cracked under questioning. They weren't professionals, just hired intimidators with criminal records scrubbed for HOA business. The plan was simple: scare him, arrest him in front of his family and neighbors, and force his hand to leave. It was about humiliation, about making him the warning sign for anyone else who dared to break the unspoken rule: stay in your place. But the cracks didn't stop with the imposters. They widened, and what poured out was filth. Messages exchanged between HOA board members dripped with coded language. Phrases like, "preserve the community," and "keep the standard," that barely masked their true meaning. Meeting notes detailed strategies to encourage compliance, a term they used like a weapon aimed squarely at him and his family. There was even a ledger tracking fines they planned to impose with projections of expected outcomes. In other words, how much pressure they could apply before he gave up. Every detail carved into the narrative of his life, a truth he'd long known but hoped to avoid facing here. Hate doesn't vanish with wealth or education or a title on your badge. It hides, waiting for the perfect moment to remind you that in their eyes you will never belong. The HOA president, the man whose smug face had haunted his thoughts that night on the porch, denied everything at first. But evidence doesn't bend to lies, and soon, even his allies abandoned him. One by one, the board members were subpoenaed, their secrets spilling in depositions that left the neighborhood buzzing with scandal. News crews camped at the entrance, cameras flashing as reporters dug for every sordid detail. And through it all, he remained steady. Not because it didn't hurt, but because it did. Deeply. Each revelation twisted the knife, not just for what they tried to do to him, but for what it said about the world his daughter was growing up in. She had seen the men in fake uniforms. She had felt the tension, heard the whispers. How do you explain to a child that some people will hate you for existing? How do you tell her that even when you reach the highest ranks of justice, prejudice still tries to chain you down? He didn't tell her that. Instead, he told her the truth that mattered, that no one's hate defines your worth, and no one's power is greater than your resolve to stand firm. He showed her by fighting, not with anger, but with accountability. The imposters pled guilty to multiple charges, their sentences swift and decisive. The HOA president and two board members faced indictments for conspiracy, fraud, and harassment. Civil suits followed, draining their resources as the community turned against them. For those who once stood in silent approval, their silence now felt like guilt. The neighbors who had peeked through blinds that day could no longer pretend they didn't know. Some avoided his gaze entirely. Others came forward, apologies tumbling out like coins tossed into an empty well. He listened but offered nothing, more than a nod. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give to erase someone else's shame. It's a peace you choose when the weight becomes too heavy to carry. Months passed, and the neighborhood changed. Not overnight, but slowly, painfully, like a wound learning how to heal. New leadership replaced the old HOA board, policies rewritten with transparency as the cornerstone. Diversity workshops were held, performative at first, but then something real began to take root. Neighbors started waving again. Not all of them, but enough. His daughter played freely on the streets now, laughter echoing like a small rebellion against the darkness that tried to silence it. And yet some scars never fade. Every time he drove through the gates, he felt it, the memory of what they tried to take from him. It lingered in the bricks of his home, in the corners of his mind where trust had once lived untouched. But it didn't break him. If anything, it fortified him. Because here's the truth they never understood. Power built on hate is fragile. It crumbles the moment it meets someone who refuses to bow. They thought they could define his place, shrink his life to fit their comfort. Instead, they became the cautionary tale, and he remained the headline they never saw coming. Chief of Police takes down HOA conspiracy. But beyond the headlines, beyond the justice served, lies the question that haunted him long after the sirens faded. If this can happen to a man with a badge, with authority, with resources, what happens to those who have none? That question isn't his alone. It belongs to all of us. Because every letter, every whisper, every quiet act of exclusion isn't just a story, it's a warning. And the next time you see it happening, will you look away? Or will you stand where it matters most, between silence and justice?